Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today at the U.S. Climate Action Center at COP26. I wanted to live stream directly from the pavilion floor or the Action Hub. You see my screen behind me here. I took a picture of it because 10,000 people trying to pull off one Wi-Fi is not the best for a streaming webinar, let me tell you. But thank you for joining us here today to talk about embodied carbon. And we're going to focus on what the US and UK are doing in terms of scope 3, in terms of embodied carbon. But we'll also touch on what's going around the world a little bit. So who the heck are we? Who are you listening to right now? And who's this very handsome gentleman I have with us? Obviously, I am from the United States, and we're being hosted by the US Climate Action Center. So I am from the United States. My name is Josh Jacobs, Director of Sustainability for WAP Sustainability. But since we are being graciously hosted in Glasgow, I figured why not go get a really one of the smartest UK residents I know, Sean McCarthy, Order of the British Empire. Mr. McCarthy, I always forget, do I have to call you sir with that OBE behind there? Are you knighted? What is happening?
No, Josh, we've had this conversation before. You really don't have to call me sir. I do not live in a castle. I don't have a butler. You know, I just have a nice thank you from the Queen from a piece of work that I did a few years ago in the London Olympics. And Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
And it's Glasgow, by the way, Josh.
I know.
Glasgow. Come on.
I've been screwing it up all week. The Scottish have certainly been reminding me. And that little piece of work, Sean, is why you are considered a global expert in sustainable procurement. So let's not minimize it. You headed up sustainable procurement for the London Olympics. And that's why the Queen was so thankful. Along with being the director and head of Action Sustainability, an organization that focuses on moving organizations ahead in their sustainable procurement. You're also chair of the Supply Chain Sustainability School, which is a wonderful resource for organizations. So, Sean, thank you so much for being here for the next hour with us.
Oh, thanks for inviting me. It's great that I have to gate crash the American delegation to get to speak at COP.
So what we're going to do is I'm going to kind of talk about why the heck we're doing this, what embodied carbon is, and then we're going to let Sean chat about what's going on in the UK, and I'm sure I'll ask some questions as him and I have our own repertoire that him and I go through with these things, and then I'll talk about the US, and then we can kind of banter on what's going on around the world. If you're listening into a COP presentation, you're not asking why carbon, but I always like to start with this. We're in the middle of a climate crisis. I'm done calling it climate change. I'm done calling it a climate problem. It's a true honest to goodness crisis, and we're on an unsustainable path. No matter the path that we pick at the moment, we are going to inalterably change our world. That is irrefutable at the moment. I can't hear any scientist actually coming up with how to oppose that at the moment. It's just varying degrees of how much we're going to change, and all the data is showing us that. The interesting part to me is not that it's about carbon and we're focused on carbon. It's that it's now trickling out beyond us, quote unquote, tree huggers, right? And climate scientists and stuff like that. Not even just the politicians. We're talking the economic world is now starting to understand this concept. If you look at the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report 2020, you'll actually see here that over the years, starting in 2007, they've talked about the evolving risks to the global economy, right? And green in this chart is environmental, right, impacts. And we know that environmental and the climate catastrophe that we're in has societal and geopolitical impacts. But look at how much the economics people, the people focused in the financial sector, have raised the environmental risk to very high levels over the years. It's almost all green, right, in terms of likelihood of global risk. The one that really shocks me here, though, is just the World Economic Forum, how do respondents perceive the impact and likelihood of global risk from 2021 report. Look, we're going through a global pandemic that hasn't been seen in 100 years, yet climate action failure is right there at likelihood and impact than infectious diseases. So this is why we're talking about carbon. Again, and why are we talking about carbon? We need to mitigate the risk that we've put ourselves in for our planet, our financial organizations are telling us for our investments, for organizational reputations, and obviously, hopefully all of us for our children and our grandchildren, those that come after us, because as the saying goes, we're just borrowing this planet from them. So what do we mean by embodied carbon? We hear people talk about we're lowering our emissions, our greenhouse gas emissions. Sometimes you'll hear terms like scope 1 and scope 2. Those are more along the lines of operational carbon. So let's get into embodied carbon and what we mean and what Sean and I are going to talk about today. So if you're trying to go from the number 100 of anything, it could be widgets, it could be Christmas presents, it could be units of carbon. To get to 0, you kind of understand that. But what if we changed it and said the number is 200 to get to 0? Obviously, that's a significant difference. Anyone in kindergarten grade level can understand that 100 and 200 are very, very different. Well, that's where we are in terms of the discussion. Right now, a lot of the conversation around neutral or net zero or negative, net zero 20 blank. I almost had t-shirts made to bring here to COP of all the commitments, net zero by 20 blank, right? It all matters on where you start to be able to get to 0, right? If you're 100 units away from 0, you know where you have to get. But if you think you're 100 and you're actually 200, it's going to take you double the time. So as I mentioned, scope 1, scope 2 are common things that are being worked on the planet by organizations. Scope 1, again, is from company facilities and company vehicles, specifically fuel burned there, right? The reporting company is burning the fuel at the source. This is the greenhouse gas emissions there. Scope 2 is that indirect purchased electricity, steam heating, cooling for own use, things of that nature. And those two have been worked on for years. People have a very good understanding how to deal with them, even have some really great ideas on how to reduce them. Heck, the past week at COP, I've heard some phenomenal new ideas on scope 1 and 2, or what people have been doing. But it's that scope 3, that indirect concepts that are upstream and downstream from us, that we need to think about as well, because there are estimates that anywhere between 30 to 50% of our carbon problem is in this scope 3 area. Obviously, depending on your industry, it can be much more as well. So the operational carbon was this big, hairy problem, right? We all know what we've done in that world, where we've started to look at it and say, okay, we need to replace our light bulbs that we use. We need to seal up our buildings better. We need to have better HVAC systems that we work with and things of that nature to ensure what we're doing. Heck, I'm working on a laptop right now that is energy efficient, and that's wonderful. We need to continue that. Please do not go away from this presentation and this conversation on anything that Sean and I say that makes you think we don't believe that scope 1 and 2 or greenhouse gas operational emissions need to be forgotten about. Those need to continue unabated. We need to continue chasing better operational carbon use. But what sits over here is this little brother at the moment, right? This embodied carbon that, hey, we're replacing that light bulb. But how much energy did it take to make that light bulb that is helping us save that operational carbon? When our buildings are retrofit, right? And we work on their building envelopes to ensure that they're better at helping us with heating and cooling or fenestration issues. How much operational carbon is it saving versus how much embodied carbon is being produced or being utilized to produce those products to help us save, right? And as we've done a great job reducing the operational carbon over time, the embodied carbon becomes a bigger and bigger problem. I would love for the day in the next year or so where operational carbon isn't even thought of as a problem anymore, and we just have to think about this embodied carbon. We're certainly not there yet, but these things are getting closer to equal footing in terms of the concern. And as operational carbon does shrink, embodied carbon impacts becomes bigger and bigger. And this, the operational carbon, plus the embodied carbon equals more of a total carbon conversation that needs to be had. instead of just thinking about that scope 1, scope 2 operational carbon concept. Greenhouse gas emissions, typically when people are setting those net zero targets, they're thinking along the lines of their operational or their scope 1 and 2 targets. This is a quick thing from Architecture 2030 that I love to show. It shows from the building construction world, right? So it's only one of the areas that we talk about frequently in the building sector. But when we build buildings, we've done a great job with things like US Green Building Council's LEED program, here in the UK with the BREEAM program from BRE. There's many Australia Green Star, the Singapore BCA Green Mark. There's many labels around the world that have helped our buildings become better at saving building operational carbon. The thing about it, though, is when a building is built, almost all of its embodied carbon is in the building, right? You've already spent that carbon before you've spent an ounce of operational carbon to run the building. Now, certainly you'll have retrofits and people will tear out the carpet and put new carpet in, or redo walls, or add paint, or even completely redo entire floors. But again, most of your operational carbon isn't even in the building yet by the time it's built. And as that goes over time, the embodied carbon, that scope 3 carbon of that building, reduces as you play it out over the life of the building. In this case, a 50-year building, say. Building operations builds that carbon. But what hasn't been taken into account, and you'll see my very fancy pen work here on the next slide, is we haven't taken into account that we're greening the grid at a greater rate. So as we green our grids around the world, maybe this operational carbon will actually not just plateau and flatten out, but it could reduce significantly, right, over time. Whereas that embodied carbon of material, that never changes from the moment you've built that building. You're not going to be getting greener energy in the factories for the products you've already put into the building. So there's a chance that the operational carbon never actually crosses paths with that embodied carbon impact. Again, just a quick graph on that construction world. And again, this isn't just about construction products. Like I said, it's about electronics. We deal with buildings in total. We deal with cars, vehicles. I had a conversation with an airplane designer earlier today at COP about embodied carbon. It's everywhere. But this is a good graph to understand that it's not just that operational stage maintenance carbon or operational carbon. There is carbon throughout the life cycle of a product, from the manufacturer and design stage of products and buildings, to the construction stage, to the throwing away. Here we call it the deconstruction stage. If we're lucky, we deconstruct buildings. But longer term, the waste has a carbon impact to it. None of this conversation is possible without data. One fear I have today, and Sean, I'll be interested in your opinion here in a second, is I'm hearing a lot of commitments from organizations, and that excites me. I'm very happy about that, but it also worries me that you hear these commitments. We're going to be net zero by 20 blank. Again, the t-shirt I should have had made here at COP. But the concern is when you dive in and end up starting talking to the organizations, you ask them, hey, so what data do you have? Where can we start working? How can we look at things to, heat map and bring down and great? And they don't even have the data. So I always wonder, how did they come up with zero by a date if you don't know where you started, right? Back to that original conversation. So gathering the data, scope 1 and scope 2, many, many ways to gather it today. Greenhouse gas protocols on it that have been utilized for years and years. Organizations do it very well, and have many different organizations to help you, including Sean's and mine would help talk about your greenhouse gas emissions in scope 1 and scope 2. But that scope 3, we need to start collecting data to understand scope 3. And there are organizations out there that are actually doing this. It's really wonderful to hear, but we need more and more to start looking at that scope 3. Again, this is just sort of that conversation where it needs to be a complete pie, right? Scope 1 and scope 2, easy to start kind of area to look at, understand, go get. You can use, gas bills and electric bills and things of that nature to look at. But that scope 3, you need to truly dive in to your supply chain and your use phase world and waste at the end of life to really fully understand it. Sean, I'm going to ask you a question here about what the UK is doing in this area over time, but I kind of wanted to start with a level set here of what embodied carbon is. What haven't I touched on there, sir? If you could give some flavor to another thought process around what embodied carbon is.
Yeah, thanks very much, Josh. I guess, the conversation is very similar here in the UK at the moment. Everybody's talking about scope 3, scope 3, scope 3. A lot of organizations are saying they've got a pretty good handle on their scope 1 and 2 emissions. I don't necessarily always believe that because, as Josh said, you need to have the data and you need to be able to provide the evidence. I guess the only other thought from my perspective at this moment is that somebody else's scope 1 and scope 2 is part of your scope 3. It's all about the value chain. I think we need to think about scope 3 emissions in at least two different ways. One way is thinking about the materials, as Josh said, the stuff that we buy, the concrete, the bricks, the steel, the cladding, the electronic components, whatever it might be, that has some embodied emissions in that product that we buy. But in addition to that, our supply chain also has its own emissions operationally, which if it's within our supply chain, then that's part of our scope 3. And I think one of the things that we're finding is there's an incomplete understanding of all of those things. And as we procure more services, and more maybe goods as services, as we're looking to, procure the use of a jet engine for its life by way of example, or if we're looking to produce delivered goods or maybe supply and install type of goods, there are emissions related to that operation of that organization as well. And measuring those things starts to become more and more complex. So yeah, scope 3 is where it's at. I completely agree with you, Josh. We can't ignore operational emissions because a lot of organizations still haven't got their head around it. I suppose the other thing from my perspective, before we get into depth in what's happening in the UK, is actually it's not really rocket science. If you look at if you look at products, and a number of product manufacturers in the UK that supply the big carbon emitting products like concrete, steel, those sort of things, they've got a pretty good handle on the emissions of their product lines now because their customers continue to ask for it. But when you go deeper into the supply chain to ask about their operational emissions, really it's your electricity bill, it's your gas bill, it's your vehicle miles, it's those pretty simple things. So everybody has that data. It's a question of how we actually pull it together to understand it in a better way. And I think is the challenge. So I think for me, we're both consultants in this field. And for me, consultants often have a propensity to make things sound more complicated. So you can sell more consultancy to your client because they believe it's complicated. Actually, it's not, in the majority of cases, it's not that complex. It can be done.
Yeah. So Sean, you've just told everyone we're not as smart. So thank you. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
I was trying to pretend that we were the wicked smart ones in the room, if I may steal something from my Boston heritage. But no, you are right in terms of it's driving down into the supply chains, right? And to be honest, I mean, there's lots of issues with understanding supply chains now. I mean, here at COP, there's been presentations on slave labor and equity in the supply chain and fair pay and obviously indigenous peoples' rights and things of that nature. So there's massive amounts of things going on in the supply chain. But driving this down through the supply chain is where I think the expertise comes in, right? And how to get it out. I have loved that. And in fact, I've used the same statements in the past that, your scope 1 and 2 is someone else's scope 3. Obviously, there are things that add on to that, certainly. But as we green over time our grids and our operational energy, it will help scope 3. There's no question. But until every single factory and every single supplier is on a quote unquote renewable grid, then we are going to have that impact, right? That our carbon, it's not just pulling stuff out of the ground, right? The essential minerals, there will be operational carbon that becomes my scope 3 upstream, right? So it is a very interesting animal that it is all passed up the chain and down the chain but we need the chain to connect better than it is today in terms of information and really getting that information through. So Sean, you had mentioned that there's a lot of talk around scope 3, and ask that question to you. And I may jump in occasionally with a question, because again, as we know, the US and UK are long-term friends, but we don't always understand each other. So that you can tell by me not even being able to say the name of the city that I'm in correctly. But please let us know what's going on in the UK around embodied carbon and scope 3 emissions, if you would.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. To quote Sir Winston Churchill, two nations divided by a common language sometimes, but yeah, we understand each other reasonably well.
Certainly.
Okay, so what's happening in the UK around scope 3? Well, I think if I were to look at things like big infrastructure projects and publicly funded projects in the UK, I think the knowledge of embodied carbon is quite good. And we start to see, very large road building, rail building, environmental projects, those sorts of things, starting to make decisions around carbon. They really are evaluating the options using carbon. And so when you're starting to look at how you might, build a railway, for example, those things are modeled using commonly available now carbon tools, where we can start to understand that the difference in emissions between various different options that are available for our infrastructure projects. And, lo and behold, not surprisingly, the lowest carbon option is usually the cheapest. And that's something that's that's been explored in the UK for quite some time. As Josh said, I was involved in the London Olympics, London 2012. I chaired something called the Commission for a Sustainable London 2012, which was a strategic assurance body that was assuring the promise that we would deliver the most sustainable games ever. And back in 2008, 2009, we were looking at the embodied carbon emissions of some of the buildings. There was an initiative to go out to buy concrete, where 50% of the evaluation score for the concrete was based on the carbon footprint of that concrete. And lo and behold, the supplier with the lowest carbon footprint was also the cheapest supplier. There is a direct correlation between cost and carbon emissions. So I think in projects, big infrastructure projects in construction, it's certainly not a perfect world, but because the client now, the end client, usually a government body or a government agency of some sort, is saying you must consider carbon throughout the process, throughout the design and construction of a project. So that is looking pretty good. I think
Sean,
in other parts, yeah.
One real quick thing there, Sean.
Yeah.
So you're talking like infrastructure, rail projects and
Yeah.
highways and stuff like that. But also, are we talking governmental buildings as well themselves? I mean, I know you said back in the London Olympics, which, I don't want to age you, sir, but was a fairly long time ago. You were looking at embodied carbon in buildings at that point. Are governmental buildings in the UK looking at embodied carbon now as they build?
Yeah, in the main, I mean, not always, obviously. And as you say, yes, if we look at London Olympics, it was ago we were building the infrastructure. It was around about, we won the bid in 2005, and it was around about 2008 the facilities were being designed. And embodied carbon was quite a new thing then, but it was certainly being looked at. And it is a little more commonplace now in government buildings and infrastructure, and through some more enlightened commercial clients, if you like. I think where it tends to break down, obviously, then is in construction, is in the smaller projects, into commercial projects. Although, Josh, as you always say very eloquently, there's much more interest now from investors. So, if you're going to get money for buildings from institutional investors, then you better start looking at the carbon footprint. So that's kind of moving on. If I think about other scope 3 related issues, there are some sectors in the UK that don't even know what their supply chain is beyond tier 1. That's certainly an issue in the construction sector, where I do a lot of work, where a large organization will commission a tier 1 contractor to do some building of some sort. that tier one contractor will divert at least 80% of their expenditure to their supply chain. And that then disappears into a very, very deep and very, very wide supply chain that comprises an awful lot of very small businesses. And I'll come back to that in a moment if I can. So in some sectors, the understanding of the supply chain is really not there. Sorry, Josh, did you have a question?
No, I said, please. Yeah. Interesting to hear
Okay.
that. Sorry.
Yeah. So I think there are other clients in other sectors that we work with, like automotive, where we're doing. I'm going to name drop a little bit here. We're doing a bit of work with Bentley,
Oh,
sustainable luxury. Yeah.
do you get an example car to drive around?
No,
with?
no, Josh, I do not get an example card.
No
No, I don't live
samples.
I don't live in a castle.
Okay.
No, seriously, the automotive sector and the retail sector, other sectors do understand their supply chains intimately. So, car manufacturers understand their supply chains down to the last nut and washer. So there are some big differences, I think, between sectors and their fundamental understanding of their supply chains. I think if I come back to construction and think about small businesses, then if you get down to these small family-owned businesses, I think in the States, Josh, you call them mom and pop shops, then no, they don't actually understand too much that this is an issue. This is not that these businesses are incompetent or bad businesses. It's just that they have a lot of other things to think about. So understanding their carbon footprint is not necessarily something that they do. And I've certainly seen some examples from tier one contractors that we work with who have been trying to help through an initiative that I run called the Supply Chain Sustainability School to upskill those small businesses to get them to understand what their carbon footprint is and then do things to reduce it. Lo and behold, they find themselves saving an awful lot of money. So there's a lot of wasted cash in the system here, because it's very, very difficult to reach out to those small businesses in the value chain. And then it comes back to what I'm talking about, making it simple and keeping it simple. One of the things that we've done in the supply chain school is we've rolled out a carbon calculator free of charge. Very simple cloud-based application. You can go in there, you record, your number of kilowatt hours of electricity, your road miles, your gas, whatever it is you're doing. 6 or 7 pieces of information you can put into the system that will give you a carbon footprint. The system also enables you to apportion that carbon footprint to your clients at the next stage up the value chain, simply by using finance. So if you're a subcontractor in tier Z of Balfour Beatty's supply chain, what proportion of your turnover goes to Balfour Beatty? You put in, 22% or whatever it is, and that will then allocate 22% of that carbon to Balfour Beatty. It's really, really simple. And the other thing that we're doing, because the supply chain school is funded by its partners, is we're doing it for free. We're trying not to add cost to the supply chain. By doing this, we're actually trying to add value. So I think the issue of understanding who is in your supply chain, where are they and what do they do, still remains an issue here in the UK. And then the investment in helping those suppliers to really understand their emissions in as simple a way as possible is an essential next step for me. I think that I've learned some other fascinating things literally in the last couple of days. I was talking to a manufacturer of flooring in the construction sector a couple of days ago, a multinational manufacturer based in France. And they're really savvy. They really understand their carbon footprint. They're really into circular economy. They actually buy in waste in order to recycle the waste into flooring products. They pay for waste, they're buying it, which is a whole kind of different economic dynamic, something that you used to pay to throw away, you're now actually being paid for. You're making money out of it. Yeah. 20% of the carbon footprint of their product is in how their customers dispose of it.
Yeah,
most of it is incinerated. they have a take back scheme. If they sell you some flooring, they will take it back. But the problem is, somebody buys some flooring, they put it into a building, they sell the building, the next owner sells the building again. 10 years later, they want to replace the flooring. And you're three owners down the line, and they don't even know that. But these guys are desperate to get the flooring back.
Yeah,
They'll take it. Yeah, they'll take it back for nothing because they can put it into their value chain as a circular economy issue. But the thing that totally blew me away was this 20% number. The fact that it's 20%, it's 20% of the emissions are in how their customers dispose of their products. And they know that. It's back to your point earlier, Josh, of data. They actually know that that's where 20% of their emissions comes from. So their challenge now is how the hell do we get the product back from our customer in order to recycle the damn stuff? And I mean, just as another example, I did some very early work, again, quite a long time ago, in around about 2008 with Marks and Spencer, a retailer in the UK, where they were doing a lot of work on their Plan A. And one of the things that they discovered was that a very large proportion of their carbon footprint was in how their customers wash, dry, and iron the garments that they sell.
Yeah.
And that inspired them to do more, wash at, lower temperature wash products, non-iron products, those sorts of things that we kind of see that are quite commonplace today. But in 2008, that was quite an interesting and new concept. So it does come back to this issue of what do you know about your value chain? And Josh, on your slide, you talked about end of life carbon potentially being quite critical. We've had clients where 99% of their carbon footprint is in scope 3. And it's, the starting point is really knowing that. So, yeah, we've got a long way to go. I think in the UK, as you know, I do a lot of work around the world, and Josh and I have worked with various different nations around the world on the ISO 2400 program. I think the UK is ahead in many ways. We've done very well at decarbonising our grid. We were the first nation to have legislation related to climate changes. You could argue we're not actually complying with our own legislation, but at least we've got it. And, the decarbonisation of the grid has gone quite well. So I think we're in a better position than some, but there is so much more to be done. And as you say, Josh, it's ultimately, it's all about supply chains. It's all about having good information, and it's about investing in those supply chains, particularly the small businesses in the supply chains, to help them, because in the UK, a very large proportion of businesses are small to medium enterprises, and that's the case everywhere in the world. It doesn't change. Ultimately, the big mass of businesses are actually quite small, often family owned, often really busy doing what they do and doing it well. Those guys need help, and they need simple tools to help them to make it happen.
Yeah, no, Sean, and thank you so much. It's amazing, no matter where we talk about that, the problems are the same, and it's understanding, right? Like you mentioned, that an organization understands that 20% of their carbon impact comes from a very, well, now you've heat mapped. Now you know exactly where to target your funds or your time or your effort that you can focus in on. It's I call it the Levi's, right? And Levi's and Tide, and not to name drop, but like you said, Levi's came out and said, hey, you don't need to wash our jeans every time you wear them, by the way, because all of their carbon impact, right, is in that wash cycle. Tide knows that, at least in America, people have been washing on warm and hot water for years. Well, that's where most of their impact was. And so they started to explain to people, our stuff works in cold water. We work, Sean, we're doing work with a large cardboard manufacturer that does a lot of cardboard for a lot of the world. And same thing, they're taking in waste because it's a supply chain. I've always made the contention that we mislabeled waste from the beginning. It should just be another supply chain for everyone, right? Because there's a lot of stuff in there. I mean, we're going to start mining these landfills that we have around the world for precious metals very shortly, my friends, if we keep buying new phones and laptops and things like that. So Sean, that's wonderful. Thank you again in terms of the UK and where you are. And by the way, you didn't have to show off by saying that you guys can pass climate legislation. You know, we're working on that in the US. We just passed our infrastructure bill. We're working on our large Build Back Better reconciliation bill, which hopefully will unlock even some more climate work that we can do in the United States. So that's awesome. So in terms of the US, and Sean, as I go through, please feel free to jump in with any questions as always. We've done some fairly good things at different levels. As I joked a little bit at the federal level, we went through a little bit of a hiatus there with carbon, as many folks around the world probably knew. In fact, our statement here at COP of most of the US delegates that are walking around is America is all in. We are back in. We're very proud of that. And a number of us are wearing our pins that we're all in on climate here. So let me go through briefly some of the stuff that's happening in the US around embodied carbon specifically. The first thing I'm going to bring up is these Buy Clean Acts. The reason it's called that is legitimately kind of the grandfather of all our Buy Clean Acts came out of the state of California. Like many things in the sustainable marketplace, California likes to lead, being the fifth or sixth largest economy on the planet and very sustainably focused. They came up with the Buy Clean California Act. And what that set out essentially is that state-funded purchases of 4 types of products, specifically structural steel, steel rebar, flat glass, which is essentially windows, and mineral wallboard insulation. Please don't ask me why specifically that last one. That's an entire presentation in and of itself. Have to have a global warming potential maximum number that the State Department of General Service Engineering had to develop by gathering all of the environmental product declarations for those products, understanding them, and then purchasing based on products had to show that they're below that. So this was the first time that in the United States, and I believe in a large term like this around the world, where a government said, look, we are going to use our spending power through a legislative realm and put our procurement teams, and Sean is very familiar with procurement on a global basis, having helped led Heathrow Airport and the London Olympics and many World Cups and other Olympics through their procurement journey. And California said, we're going to use our dollars. So this isn't a new tax on their citizens. They're using their money that they are already spending for these products on projects within the state of California to do better, right? And to pick better products and actually setting maximum global warming potential limits. Now, since that, there's been a number of others throughout the United States. The state of Colorado has passed something similar where they're looking at purchasing low carbon products with state funds. Again, no new money going into, right? It's using the state funding that we're already doing in procurement. The state of Washington actually has decided to develop a database for these types of products, and they're running a pilot on the selection and procurement of products. Minnesota also is developing a statewide pilot along these lines as well. In fact, just while I was here at COP, I learned of the state of New Jersey has a concrete footprint law that has just been passed by the legislation that focuses on lower embodied carbon concrete. Sean, as you had mentioned, concrete and steel have a very good handle on what's going on a global basis. They've known that they have some issues in their embodied carbon for a long time, but they've also done a lot of work in the US. There's a lot of discussion around zero steel, for example, in terms of how to actually make steel, because they can be very intensive, energy intensive and carbon intensive, but hopefully being able to pull that back as we move forward. Another thing that the states, and it was just officially announced here at COP by Governor Inslee from the state of Washington, he announced that the Pacific Coast Collaborative, which is a number of states on the US coast of the Pacific, shockingly enough, the name works, they've launched the Low Carbon Construction Task Force. What the Low Carbon Construction Task Force is to look at how to increase the market development the development of and the procurement of low carbon products. Now, one of the Pacific Coast collaborators, I'm sure, California, is saying, hey, we've already done it with our Buy Clean California Act. Why can't we just roll this out further? But they want to make it more holistic. The rollout of the Buy Clean California Act in California was not, shall we say, smooth, as anyone can guess when you deal with procurement and millions of dollars in purchases. It's not always the easiest path forward. Sean, I'm sure you could regale us over a pint about Olympic purchasing and how wonderful that could have been, and some of the wonders that went through. But again, this low carbon construction task force that the Pacific Coast Collaborative, number of states in the US that are putting together to understand how to figure out better carbon procurement of products, right? And incentivize that in a certain way. If I had to postulate and take an educated guess, knowing a number of the states and the folks who are working through it, I'm guessing that they're going to come back to that procurement process. Maybe not in legislative form like California did, which leads to some of the issues, but simply using their procurement to push down that carbon, that embodied carbon in products. Another interesting area is what we call our code system in the United States. Because of our size and the way that the United States was set up, during, Sean, what I affectionately like to call first Brexit, when we decided to leave Britain, which, by the way, I thought we did it with a flourish, but just me. Anyway.
You do everything with a flourish, Josh.
We really do. We really do. It's kind of our American way, right? And during our Brexit, the way we were set up, we have lots of different codes throughout the United States. We have model codes, but individual states and municipalities can vote and have their own codes for buildings and things of that nature. So there is something called the International Green Construction Code, or the IGCC, which is actually the technical guts are taken from a standard called ASHRAE 189.1. I am directly involved in both of those, so full disclosure. They have carbon requirements within them. You can use environmental product declarations to help you meet material credits. There's a whole building life cycle path that you can take to show a building's impact. So looking at carbon in these ways, at least starting to look at that carbon. The great thing is the IGCC has actually been adopted as a pathway in a number of states as a way to comply with state green building requirements. Then there are municipalities like the Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Denver, Phoenix, a number of others that have utilized the IGCC as part of their code. They've actually integrated it into the building, electric, fire, structural code system that they have. One that shocks people is actually Dallas, Texas. Not always known as a hub of sustainability, but Dallas, Texas has adopted a green code that has embodied carbon focused concepts within it. Additionally, again, the state of California has the Cal Green Code. They are the first state that I know in the United States that adopted a statewide California Green Building Code. They obviously have a lot in there in terms of operational energy and things of that nature. They haven't focused a ton on embodied carbon yet. We are working with the state of California to hopefully get that state code to actually start to look at embodied carbon. Finally, on the federal level, which is always the interesting one for the United States, what the heck are we doing federally, Sean, is we've actually had previous versions of the Buy Clean concept that was in the state of California and other states, as I mentioned, proposed in our legislation. In fact, the last couple of sessions of our Congress before this one actually had Buy Clean acts proposed. They did not move forward for some obvious reasons, if you understand the US political nature. We do envision some of those potentially coming back, but more importantly, in this current Build Back Better reconciliation bill that is before our Senate at the moment and our House legislation, that hopefully will be approved here shortly, there's literally language in it around our EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, helping agencies understand how to procure low carbon products, right? And actually helping manufacturers to understand their own embodied carbon to then be able to sell to the federal government. There's literally language in a Department of Energy section of this reconciliation bill. And I get very excited about this because it's one of those first times that a DOE, money has been allocated for our Department of Energy, where it doesn't just talk about the operational energy. They literally make the statement, procurement of low carbon products. This is in a legislative bill that is, knock on wood, about to be passed by the US. Imagine that, Sean. US purchasing power coming out behind low carbon product purchasing. This is incredible for us in terms of folks like you and I who deal with embodied carbon on a daily basis. Additionally, we certainly know what the White House with President Joe Biden and many others, Secretary Kerry, have been working together to understand what we can do in terms of the climate crisis and how potentially federal procurement through our United States General Service Administration, the largest purchaser on the planet, frankly, once outside the US military probably, how they can utilize their purchasing power to lower embodied carbon products. I know a number of organizations have been working with them to draft concepts that they could push down as well with this reconciliation bill. So that's where we are, Sean, in the US. It hasn't always been the most cheery updates when I give updates on the US. But again, one thing that has come through, I feel, is that where we were, unfortunately, the last 4 years with the climate crisis wasn't always very good to feeling or in the updates that we had. But I think a lot of states, municipalities, and even organizations stepped up in that wake to fill some of the void. I mean, we even had companies signing on to the Paris Agreement, and folks around the world are like, hey, wait a minute, it wasn't built for businesses. And they said, yeah, but we're going to sign it anyway. So that's kind of where we are in the US, Sean. Hopefully we've impressed you a little bit with where we're coming.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. I guess, as you know, I've done business with the United States for a number of years in my long career. My impression very much of things in the States is once you decide to do something, really decide to do it, then it's done big and fast. It's sometimes, you're a little bit late to come to the party or to deal with things. And certainly in my background in the aviation industry, after the tragedy of 9/11, the speed at which the American government set up the TSA and dealt with security at airports was, I witnessed that firsthand, and it was absolutely astonishing. I would say, as somebody formerly of the aviation sector, security at American airports before 9/11 was not great and could have been better. But the speed at which that initiative was taken just totally blew me away. The concept, as you say, of using American government purchasing power to drive low carbon is absolutely amazing. Do you think this is something that will happen with that sort of level of commitment that we've seen in the past?
The folks, Sean, let's put it this way. I am as optimistic as I've been about our government moving a lever as I've ever been in my years working in sustainability. We've always had a commitment to sustainability on some executive order level and things of that nature. But truly, honestly, this reconciliation bill and the news from the White House of where they're moving potentially on new executive orders really girds me to feel good and not feel let down of where we're going. Because again, we're talking trillions of dollars in procurement that can be. And once you start talking in B's and T's in money, Sean, you know that the marketplace will jump. So.
Oh, absolutely. It would ask how high if this really happens. I guess my other question, Josh, is, if we look at the influence in the United States, big tech, if you name, the top 10 big technology companies in the world, and they're all American, they're your Googles and your Facebooks and your Apple and all of those things.
Alibaba might have an argument with you.
Yeah, okay, maybe. But how do you see the influence of those organizations? Because as you say, certainly from my perspective on the other side of the pond, I was seeing big tech just forging ahead, regardless of what the federal administration was doing or saying.
Yeah, and they did. They have. You're absolutely correct. Here at COP, I've actually spoken with and listened to a number of speakers from someone like Microsoft. Again, not endorsing anyone directly, obviously, please understand that. But they are talking, and Sean, unprompted, they mentioned scope 3 and how that was their biggest area, right? And they own lots of square footage around the world. And yet their scope 3 is where they need to make their cuts, right? And they personally came out and said that. And I know a number of the other organizations. I don't think it's officially public yet, but there is a large building owned by a tech firm on the West Coast. Could be the largest building on the United States West Coast, that we've worked with them for them to understand their embodied carbon in their building, their entire building, right? So they are understanding this concept. Certainly the data centers that they put together are operationally a massive carbon problem, or could be. They're addressing a lot of those as well. But the scope 3, they understand that it's, that 30 to 50%, and they need to think about it. So it's awesome. So Sean, with the couple minutes we have left, always the UK and US focused, of course we are, but the around the world concept, I brought it up briefly before, but would love a minute or two to hear your thoughts here on that financial, right? That is the biggest thing I see going on around the rest of the world in terms of, not as much legislation as potentially in the UK and US, things of that nature, but that financial aspect where someone like a CEO of BlackRock, Larry Fink, comes out and demands carbon plans, right? What have you been hearing that over here and around the world as well?
Yeah, definitely. I think this is something that in the last 12 to 18 months, the pressure from investors is starting to really bite. And I'm certainly working with private sector clients that are terrified of what their investors are asking for, and recognizing that borrowing is likely to get more expensive, that their stock value could potentially go down if they're not really investing in climate technology. And certainly organizations like BlackRock saying, we will vote boards of directors off the board if you don't have a credible story on climate change. So that is becoming much more of an issue, particularly for PLCs and unlisted companies, obviously, but even organizations that are influenced by private investors. This is becoming a big driver. And as you know, when we developed the ISO 2400 standard, we developed this concept of drivers where you encourage an organization to think about why you need to be sustainable, because your drivers will ultimately drive your what. And I run sessions like this with executive committees and boards of directors. And a year, 18 months ago, what about investors? Are investors driving to be sustainable? Nah. They're only they're just interested in return on investment. Forget them. But then I'd sometimes say, well, okay, but how do you know? Have you spoken to your head of investor relations? Do you really know? But then 18 months, 2 years ago, the answer would still come back. Now we've spoken to investor relations and they don't really care. Oh my God, is that a different answer now? It's changed a lot. So drivers from customers, drivers from investors, and also from employees. And this is the younger generation of people coming through, a lot of whom are represented at COP, where you are, Josh, are making their career choices around sustainability, and that they want to work with companies that have a really credible story to tell. And the dash for talent is a global thing. We're all looking to try and recruit the best people, and those best people these days want to understand that there's a good story on sustainability generally, but climate change in particular.
Yeah, Sean, and we're, yes, from the public and private companies that rush to answer investor questions, we're actually working with investment firms who are having us look at companies for them, right, and get data. It's really unreal, the amount. One other thing I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up, so Sean, if you'll give me a minute to say this before we say our goodbyes, I'm very proud to announce that tomorrow we will be publishing a new greenhouse gas protocol that we worked with WRI on around the methodology for how to account for embodied emissions in built environment projects. WAP, my organization that I work for, is very proud to work on this. And it's going to help companies clearly measure and report on that embodied emissions using a greenhouse gas protocol, right? We've had those greenhouse gas protocols for scope 1 and 2 for years, and they've worked very well in scaling this around the world. But this is going to specifically clarify that scope 3 concept for people in that built environment, in that embodied emissions in that built environment. It's a wonderful concept. We feel very proud of it. We hope that it moves forward in conversations and working with things like the SASB standards and science-based target initiative to bring the investment community and everyone else to understand embodied, start looking at it. And Sean, some of these investor questions hopefully get consistent in their ask and consistent in their answering, and really hopefully shift some of that procurement instead of being a, this product type versus this product type, but within the product types, right? How do you make those discernible choices as you did at the London Olympics? Maybe you don't have the London Olympics budget, but hopefully you can start to make some of those choices. We plan on publishing it here at COP tomorrow, hopefully on the WRI, the World Resource Institute website tomorrow. If it does not go up, please email me and we'll be able to get it to you. Mr. McCarthy, not sir, but Mr. Sean McCarthy, it is always a pleasure to have you, sir. I learn something every time we talk and I can't say thank you enough for joining us at the U.S. Climate Action Virtual Center.
Yeah, God bless America. Thanks very much. Thanks very much for inviting me, Josh. I really appreciate it. It's a pleasure as always.
Sean, thank you so much. Everyone, thank you for your time. Email us here. It'll be recorded. It'll be up. Again, Sean, thank you very much and stay safe, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.